Good morning. Um, we're right at 9 o'clock, and I know we have a busy day, so I'm going to go ahead and see if we can get started with some introductions and some assessment of our calendar today. I'm Kim Lyerly on behalf of our sponsors, particularly the Clean Air Carolina and the NC Breathe conference that'll be held tomorrow. Wanted to welcome all of you to this sort of satellite session, if you will, on environmental PFAS and human health in 2024. The National Academies in about 2022, I think, developed a report on PFAS in the U.S. and the role of testing for PFAS in various source materials as well as people. Our own Heather Stapleton at Duke was part of that report. But this is a figure from that report that described where PFAS contamination in the U.S. occurred. And you notice the tight cluster of PFAS contamination sites right in the region that we exist in, North Carolina. And there's a variety of reasons for this, but we'll hear about that later today. The health effects of a PFAS exposure have been widely reported. Unfortunately, many of these have been associated with the legacy PFAS compounds in which there was very high levels and higher concentrations and a longer time to study these health effects. This is one figure is for the European Environmental Agency. And some of the health effects of the next generation PFAS, including Gen X, are not as well characterized just because of the exposure history and the biological effects, et cetera, are not as well studied. But certainly we're appreciative of the potential health effects of these next generation molecules. We're pleased today to have a number of keynote speakers as well as I think an outstanding group of moderators and panelists who will be addressing fundamental issues in PFAS contamination in North Carolina in particular. Ken Cook, who I'll introduce in a minute, is part of the founding group of the Environmental Working Group and currently its CEO, but developed this chart on the PFAS contamination measured in the U.S. Again, a high level of concern about drinking water exposure, drinking water levels that are above proposed limits set recently by the EPA. But one of the, I think, fascinating things about today's conference is that we'll also hear about the potential exposure of PFAS from air contamination, air exposure from manufacturing plants that may in fact spew high concentrations of PFAS into the air and again settling into the soil and water systems, but also being potentially inhaled. As we mentioned recently, the PFAS drinking water standards were recently set by the US EPA. The final limits for the legacy PFAS, the PFOA, PFAS, and so forth were any detectable level would be seen as inappropriate. And again, the lowest level detectable is 4 parts per trillion. And so these were outlawed or thought to be beyond the limit that the EPA recommended. Now, again, we'll hear from Elizabeth Biser later today about the role of the EPA regulations in North Carolina. But former Secretary Elizabeth Biser will also probably address her own concern about the air pollutant of PFAS. And she recently, on behalf of national organizations, submitted a petition to the EPA to include PFAS in the list of hazardous air pollutants. And again, we're very thankful for her leadership in addressing this source of contamination. So, as I mentioned, I'm excited about today. We have a bevy of terrific speakers, and I thought it would be appropriate to introduce some of the efforts at Duke on the environment and climate and health. We're very pleased today to have Robert Tiggy, who is leading the School of Medicine's climate research strategy. Again, I pulled this from the recent announcement of his leadership in this role. And again, I think there's nothing more appropriate than to really highlight Mary Klotman, the Dean of the School of Medicine's description of Rob as a visionary and collaborative leader to head this effort on climate research. So Rob, I'd like to have you come up and maybe present your views on today and on the School of Medicine's activities in climate and health.
Thank you, Kim. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you for the kind introduction. So as I was introduced, my name is Rob Tye. I'm an associate professor of medicine in the Duke School of Medicine, and I've been leading a strategic plan about climate and health that you'll hopefully see in the future. But I actually wanted to talk, since this is PFAS, about just a brief sort of overview of why this region of the country has been so critical to thinking about environmental health research and sort of how that's also led to some important discoveries and important work on PFAS. So as many of you all know, North Carolina has a rich educational history with a variety of institutions spread across the state. And really that's a strength of the state in terms of its ability to think critically about the important issues that exist in our country and our world, and also educating the next generation of individuals. And so I think it's really a testament to the strength of that. But also when we think about environmental health research, so I'm a physician scientist, so I came into this region as a pulmonary fellow more than getting close to 20 years ago, and was quickly attracted to environmental health. And some of that has to do with the strength of environmental health and the environmental health community in this region. And so I wanted to highlight a bit of that. Centers both at North Carolina State, a lot of which is focused on PFAS research over the years, and we're going to hear from some incredible people in those groups. Groups at UNC as well, that also have been focusing on environmental health. Groups at Duke as well, slightly biased, but the Superfund Center and then the Nicholas School of the Environment and the Integrated Toxin Environmental Health Program, which do a combination of research and education as well. But also if you realize that there are also other groups within this area that have been heavily involved in environmental health research over the years, Research Triangle International, and then even intramural sites for the federal government. So the EPA, as many of you know, has their intramural research sites based in the Triangle, and also the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences. So it's an incredible collection, but also supported by governmental agencies, including the North Carolina Environmental Quality Group, as well as the CleanAIRE group here that is sponsoring today. So it's quite a rich collection in this area, and I think that speaks to why there's been so much development over the years, and in particularly focusing on PFAS. And so these were some slides that were given to me by Lee Ferguson, who's unfortunately not able to make it today, but is very excited that we're actually doing this today. And that centers around the PFAS testing network. And so if one of you noticed that there's a lot of dots on Kim's file, some of that is because there's also been an incredible effort across the state that was a combination of a partnership between academia and state government to really start to try to figure out what was the contamination of our communities and how that's impacting them. And so as you can see, there's been a lot of sampling across the state from a variety of municipal surface water sources and groundwater sources to really look at that. And that's been a collaboration between Duke and NCSU. And so you can see that there's a wide distribution across the state, and also that there, unfortunately, is a fair amount of contamination. Though most of the compounds were below the detection limits for the majority of sites, you could observe certain compounds that were quite prevalent. And when you start to look across the state and look at different testing sites, you can see that there's a variety of different PFAS species that were being identified. And so that ends up leading to a map where you can start to see sort of what the levels are and the concentrations across the state, and really can inform public health decisions about where the need is to focus that. And that really comes from many of the people in this room who have supported those efforts over the years to really lead the way in terms of what we understand about PFAS. But I would say that this isn't done, and I know this has been a conversation that Heather Stapleton and I had. You know, I'm a physician, so I see people in the clinic, and I have to admit that when we first started talking about this, I didn't realize that there was actually a blood test that could be used in this setting. And so as much as identifying the problem is a part of it, I think the next, there certainly needs to be a thought for how do we actually take this into a clinical setting, and how is it meaningful for practitioners to be able to order these kinds of tests and then provide information back to their individuals. And so, like all things in research, you peel one layer off the onion and there's another layer underneath. This is maybe one of those other layers that really needs to be considered in terms of how do we get this out to individuals. So with that, I'm really excited that this conference is going on, and I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of the talks for today. So thank you.
Today, and again, we're going to hear a lot about PFAS, a lot of the details of the science, the technologies associated with the measurements, et cetera. But I think one perspective that I think is important is, why are we so interested in PFAS right now? Why is it such an important issue? And I don't think there's a better speaker to address this than our next speaker, Ken Cook, giving our first keynote. I've known Ken for a number of years now, but I did have to look up some aspects of his bio because the numbers are always very perplexing to me. Ken, as many of you know, is the president and co-founder of the Environmental Working Group, which is widely recognized as one of the environmental community's most prominent and influential critics of industrial agricultural, U.S. food and farm policy, and the nation's broken approach to protecting families and children from toxic substances. And here's the part that sort of gets me, is that looking at Ken, seeing how dynamic he is, seeing the many activities he's involved in, I had to look this up, that nearly 40 years ago, Ken was the principal architect of the landmark provisions of the 1985 Farm Bill that for the first time shifted U.S. farm policy from a narrow focus on maximizing crop production to conservation of land, water, wetlands, and wildlife. So a perspective that I think we all appreciate now, and understand that the long-term sustainability of agriculture, of providing food and water, quality air for us, has to consider all of these components. This was Ken really leading the charge on this many years ago, decades ago. Under Ken's leadership, the Environmental Working Group has gone on to pioneer the use of digital technologies to expose the harms done by crop subsidies, crop insurance, and agricultural pollution. And this has empowered American families, consumers, with useful data-driven tools to help reduce the exposure to potentially harmful ingredients in food, drinking water, cosmetics, and other household products. So you'll hear today Ken's remarkable history, but this is a set of beliefs and concerns that he's carried with him for decades. All of us are better for his leadership and we want to recognize what he brings. We're so pleased to have him here to really address the role of PFAS in our health and the special attention that North Carolina deserves in this area. Ken?
Good morning. How are you? It's a thrill to be here, an honor to be here. And how about CleanAIRE North Carolina? That's a good troublemaking bunch, right? From Jeffrey Robbins right across the whole team, I want to thank them for inviting me. Kim, thank you for inviting me. Alicia, I don't know where you are. She saved my life 3 times before 8:30. So commendation coming your way. EWG and PFAS, we go back a ways. I sent my first note to our staff to start working on it in August. Someone sent it to me in August of 2000. At that point, I had been in contact with a then obscure attorney named Rob Balott, who was doing his best to bring justice to people in Parkersburg, West Virginia and environs because of the contamination they experienced with the Teflon chemical, which we called it then. This was before, I've known Kim probably 20 years. This was back when PFAS wasn't PFAS. We didn't even know what to call all of this stuff. And since then, EWG has been involved in conducting investigations. We've been nonstop involved with advocacy. We've published maps indicating where we find PFAS contamination. I kick myself every time I look at that map that I didn't start testing water in 2002, 3, and 4. Rob Balott tries to comfort me and say, you probably wouldn't have had the capability to do it back then, but I didn't do it. Big mistake. We published dozens of peer-reviewed papers on the topic of PFAS. We've looked at PFAS in wildlife. We've looked at PFAS in drinking water, PFAS and its role in cancer, the immune system. We looked at PFAS in North American fish, freshwater fish. I don't know if Nadia Bardo is here today. No? Standback intern, came to work for EWG. She's the lead author in that paper that got in the New York Times and lots of other sources. So we've been at this for a while, long before these notorious poisons, as I say, were identified as PFAS. So today I want to start by talking about speed limits. Other than CleanAIRE North Carolina, my favorite nonprofit is the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. This is the place that gives you the safety ratings on your car when you're shopping, right? Which ones do the best in a crash? But they also spend a lot of time looking at the impacts of driving, in particular speed, on public health. Now, their related institute is the Highway Loss Data Institute, Highway Loss. And here are a few things from this page on their website, that in 2022, a total of 12,151 deaths, 29% of all motor vehicle fatalities came about because people were driving too fast. Seems straightforward, right? The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration says that the economic cost of those speed-related crashes was about $46 billion in 2019. $46 billion, all those deaths. Now, the reason I'm so interested in this particular organization is because every so often they do an analysis that looks at what would happen if we lowered the speed limit. Life and death, okay? So in '73, the experiment got started because speed limits were set nationally at 55 miles per hour for the first time. It was time of the oil embargo. We were trying to conserve energy. And Congress said, well, let's just lower the speed limit and save the energy. Well, the unanticipated benefit was we saved lives. So by 1974, 1 year later, there were 4,000 fewer fatalities, a 9/11's worth of fewer fatalities in 1 year by slowing down, by setting a speed limit that was safer. In 95, people were concerned we weren't going fast enough. So Congress stepped in and raised the speed limit, actually erased the national requirement for 55 miles per hour. States raised their limits. And over the period 93 to 2017, there were 37,000 additional fatalities related to the fact that we had raised the speed limit. So we were going fast, we were going deadly, and it was legal. Perfectly legal. And this is the theme I want to present to you. Just because something's legal doesn't mean it's safe. And as we stand back and look at the PFAS problem we face, and North Carolina, you have looked for PFAS. That's step one, and you've found it. Thank you. Ornery independent scientists working with state regulators, but decades after it was happening. Decades after harm was done. Important, you lead the nation, no question about that. But that was because people were curious to know what was in the environment. Now, it's not always the case that we set things as legal that are also safe. Here's an example. Chromium-6, the Aaron Brockovich chemical. This chemical is so bad it won an Academy Award. All right? It's associated with all kinds of adverse health outcomes. And it's in almost everybody's drinking water. And our early studies surveying drinking water across the country prompted EPA to then require water utilities to test for it, and that's where that number came from. Scrappy nonprofit, we tested water in 30 cities, we found it everywhere. Okay, well, California went about trying to figure out what to do. We don't have a national limit that's legal that requires action by water utilities on hexavalent chromium. Haven't gotten there yet. I'll explain why. But in California, there was enough pressure that they decided to move forward. And every environmental law has two basic steps. One is the collection of data and science and an assessment of what the appropriate response would be as science dictates it, or determines it, or estimates it. I'll let you pick. This is one of the great accomplishments of the environmental movement, is the collection of this information, the analysis of it. It didn't exist before the environmental movement came along, created these agencies, created these data collection and scientific enterprises. So these dots represent all of the communities that had a positive detect for hexavalent chromium in finished drinking water, right out of the tap. And that scale on the side is parts per billion. Now, the first step, doing the science in California, they tried to figure out what is the level, the public health goal, and the literal definition of the public health goal for drinking water in California is a level that won't cause harm. Isn't that the least we can ask of our drinking water? That when you drink it, it won't harm you? Well, they figured that that was low, 0.02 parts per billion. Now, the second step in every environmental law is the reality step. Politics, economics, lobbying, industry advocacy, nonprofit advocacy. These legal limits are adjudicated by this process that unfolds every time there's an environmental debate, okay? And when that was completed in California, the legal limit the limit where utilities would have to do something was set at 10 parts per billion, which is, if you're doing a little math, 500 times higher than state scientists said was the level that wouldn't harm you in the water. Now, all those dots between 0.02 and 10 are communities in which the water utility will be required to do nothing by law. That's the legal limit. Just because it's legal doesn't mean it's safe. Same with CleanAIRE. The CleanAIRE Act is the queen of environmental laws. It's the law that, in my view, works the best. It's the strongest. It's consistently updated. This was the recent decision by EPA, finalizing stronger standards for soot pollution. EPA said it's going to prevent 4,500 premature deaths per year. Incredible. Incredible, important public health progress. But many more Americans die of air pollution exposure than the 4,500 we're going to save. Below almost every legal limit that is set by the government for almost any pollution are many, sometimes tens of thousands of people who will not be protected because the limit's legal, but we can't quite get to safe. Right? And a lot of people, this is a savvy room, a lot of people don't get that because sometimes legal limits are kind of fudged and people suggest that they are safe or that there's no difference, or they forget to tell you that there's also a safe limit. They just talk to you about the legal limit. Everyone's in compliance at 10 parts per billion in California. Good enough for government work. No water utility is going to say, by the way, it ought to be 0.02, but we had objections from water utilities and from polluters, so we just couldn't get there. They don't say that part, right? And this is what we walk into. This is the structure of environmental policy that we walk into for PFAS. I think you could argue that that structure is as worthy of our consideration as the contamination is itself. They're claimed to be safe right up until the minute when they're not. A year ago, there was no legal limit for drinking water for PFAS in the United States. Any amount was legal. Some of them exceeded guidelines. And now we finally do have a legal limit. I'll talk about that a little bit more. But people remember this. We know from our work contacting and interacting with tens of millions of consumers every year, people remember things like, wasn't that pesticide that EPA said was safe and industry said was safe and farmers said was safe, not just last year, but for the past 40 years? Wasn't that just banned because it wasn't safe? Well, what's been going on? Now, part of this is just the nature of environmental regulation, how we go about finding problems belatedly and trying to act to them. And part of it is this negotiation process that goes on between the regulated community and all of us who are standing on the sides and saying, what's safe? Shouldn't that be what's legal? For many pollutants and many contaminants, we have no legal limits. One of the amazing things about the PFAS standard that I'll talk about in a second, 4 parts per trillion now, it's the safe limit for drinking water for 2 of the signature PFAS, and the others have a limit of about 10 parts per trillion. One of the things that's amazing about it is up until that decision was made, EPA hadn't declared a legal limit for a drinking water contaminant in 20 plus years. Lots of studies showing it was in water, lots of EPA and state assessments saying it wasn't safe, but we couldn't even set a legal limit. There was no amount that was illegal. And oftentimes, the backdrop for all this is we don't even know we're exposed, sometimes for decades. Except if you're in industry and your own studies have shown that you're exposed, that people are exposed. That's what happened with PFAS. DuPont knew for decades, tested water right in the community, tested their workers, and didn't tell them. Didn't tell them. So how do we find out how we're exposed? If you look back over time, what's our first line of defense? What's our early warning system? What's our safeguard, our safety net? Well, what is often the case in terms of safety net and system and early warning, it's not vigilant government. It's not companies doing the right thing who possess the knowledge. That's not how we find out. Here's how we find out. It's not always luck. Sometimes it's coincidence. Sometimes it's happenstance. Sometimes it's pure accident. I'll give you an example or two. DDT, professor at a university in New England who happened to be a scientist, saw dead birds on campus, took the tissue samples to his lab that he happened to have, and found DDT at very high levels. That gentleman went on to help found the Environmental Defense Fund that sued EPA and got DDT banned. But this was not the government stepping in, and this is not the companies that made DDT stepping in. This was and you got a lot of them here in North Carolina, this was an independent professor that just decided to pick up a rock and see what was under it. God bless him, right? Let's hear it for him. Come on, right? They're doing it. A scientist in, I think in Sweden, is studying DDT in wildlife, and he sees this weird little squiggle on his oscilloscope and discovers that we've got PCBs in all that wildlife too. Dioxins. A little girl gets sick when they're spraying waste oil on a road, and it gets in the horse stable where she works. She gets sick, and they discovered that that waste oil is full of dioxins. Just an accident that they found that out. Chromium-6, Aaron Brockovich shows up. You've seen the movie. Shows up in Hinckley, California. No one can figure out why everyone's getting sick. A paralegal with no scientific training, but a lot of horse sense and a lot of concern for people, she figures it out. Not the government, not PG&E. They knew PG&E, they just didn't tell anybody. Same with TCE, Wolford, Massachusetts. You all know the story of a civil action. If you don't, please read the book or see the film. Government inspector is out there and he just thinks, I know my worksheet doesn't say I should test these barrels to see what's in it, but I just, on a hunch, I think I'll do it. Just, would you call that an accident? Luck? Something like that. Not design. Not looking by design. And MTBE, it's already in the gasoline, in 90% of the gasoline in the United States when people in Alaska start getting sick from the fumes and what's in the water. And once they report that they're sick, the government looks into what to be worried about. It's banned. Now, that's a good point. I really agree with that point. I don't know. That's a really good point, right? So this brings us to PFAS, the forever chemicals, so-called, right? I would argue the worst toxic chemical crisis the world has known until the next one. Might be microplastics, nanoplastics. So bad, it's actually revitalizing environmental laws and regulations to a considerable degree. It's that bad. Just to go over a few of the highlights, this slide was labeled WTF, but I didn't want to spell it out. It's in 99% of us. Liver damage, thyroid damage, obesity, cancer, endocrine disruption, cardiovascular disease, low birth weight, reduced head circumference, birth defects, reduced vaccine efficacy in children. I've probably missed a few. There's probably some that are reported in the literature this morning. What a cluster situation, right? The safe levels over time, as scientists have looked at this, for what is considered safe in tap water, have plummeted. Now, this is true of almost every environmental contaminant you could look at. The longer we look at them, the more we study them, the lower the safe level goes, right? In the early 2000s, when we got involved, we were battling DuPont in the media in West Virginia because they set a safe level for their community at 150 parts per billion. The safe level inside the plant in their drinking water was 1 part per billion. But 150 was okay for the neighbors. EPA today, as I mentioned, just last spring, I came down for the announcement was made in North Carolina by Michael Regan, right? Something to be proud of. Is 4 parts per trillion. 150 parts per billion. The DuPont standard is 150,000 parts per trillion. Right? Times have changed. So here we are with this new legal limit. The final rule, this is EPA's assessment, will prevent PFAS exposure for 100 million people. We think actually the number might be higher. Prevent thousands of deaths. The speed limit is legal and safe, or getting there, right? And reduce tens of thousands of many other illnesses and health outcomes that Kim mentioned on his slide and I just told you about. $1.5 billion in economic benefits. I think that's an underestimate. EPA says the costs are about the same. I think that might be an overestimate. Regulated industries are constantly overestimating regulatory compliance costs. But it's not perfect. Not even really close to perfect when you look at the whole range of PFAS contamination issues. There's other PFAS that aren't covered by this drinking water rule. PFAS that we, as Kim suggested, we don't really know yet. They're out in the environment. There's enough money to make them and market them. There's just not enough money yet to study them and find out what the harm might be, right? What about PFAS in air emissions? What about PFAS in sludge and soil when it's distributed on the landscape to help municipalities who want to get rid of sludge? What about PFAS in food? What about PFAS in pesticides? We just did a peer-reviewed study with Nathan Donnelly at the Center for Biological Diversity and found PFAS in lots of pesticides. What about PFAS in wild fish, in game, in wildlife? We did a study. We found PFAS in wildlife species all over the planet. How's that for a footprint? Isn't that awful? Now, we've published a report card where we rate how well the federal government's doing, and I'm pleased to say that in the past 3 years, there's been a lot of progress. About 80% of their promises, which were ambitious, are complete. But we may not hang on to this rule. Chemical makers are suing, and so are water utilities, to overturn this PFAS standard. That's right. Some of you are paying money as ratepayers to water utilities, and they're taking just a little bit of that money and investing it in overturning this drinking water standard. I can't name any names in North Carolina, but maybe some will come to your mind. And we think that if this happens, if this rule is overturned, in court, or perhaps, given the politics of the times, by other actions taken in Congress or elsewhere, more than 40 million people could lose PFAS drinking water protections that they will have under that existing rule, 4 parts per trillion, and higher levels, 10 parts per trillion, for a few other species of PFAS. Let's fight for safe and legal PFAS speed limits across all of these exposure routes, shall we? Shall we fight for those? Yeah? We want legal to be safe. We want someone who hears that something is approved or okayed by the government to know that it's approved and okayed because it won't hurt you. The least we can do. And then finally, and this is my closing thought, I want you to also appreciate that the enormity of the PFAS contamination crisis and all of its health outcomes that are involved has really sort of shaken up global thinking about contamination. This was building. PFAS really took it over the top, where scientists everywhere are saying, you know, our system for evaluating these kinds of exposures is exceeding what we think is reasonable for the survival of the planet and the people and other inhabitants of the planet. We've exceeded the operating space. Now, I used to make fun of these scientists for calling PFAS and microplastics novel entities. I thought, well, that's not really very catchy. And then I realized I was the one who came up with Environmental Working Group. So I don't want to criticize them for bad branding. But the fact of the matter is, scientists everywhere are retreating from the old model built on risk assessment, looking one chemical at a time, never looking at chemicals in combination, and are deciding, you know what? Maybe we should focus on avoiding exposure. Because we ain't gonna regulate all these at this pace. It's just not gonna happen. We're never gonna regulate them in combination. We need to step back and think about protecting the planet by having a more comprehensive, common sense approach. I'm not drawn to the term precautionary principle because I think it's makes us too vulnerable into thinking we just won't make a move until we know we're safe. But what I am drawn to is this notion that we should look at the hazardous properties of chemicals with full transparency to understand that exposures are happening. The combination of those two things, that should weigh very heavily in decision making, and we should start protecting the planet and all of us from these chemicals by avoiding exposure. And sometimes avoiding exposure means you need to get rid of this stuff. Because we can't avoid PFAS now. It's in all of us. That's what's changed, and PFAS has pushed that argument to the forefront. Now there's no place in the country that understands these dynamics better than North Carolina. And there's no place that stepped up and tried to confront the PFAS problem better than North Carolina. So I am proud to be here. I'm proud to be fighting by your side. Anytime we can help you, please let us know. And please keep up making this good trouble. I love this organization. I love gathering people like this, like-minded people, to be a little depressed, fresh ways to be depressed. More importantly, fresh ways to be inspired, and you inspire me. Thank you.
I'm now going to call on my esteemed colleague, Mr. Bill Ross. Bill Ross was former Secretary of Environmental Quality. He played a pivotal role in one of the most meaningful environmental policies established in the state of North Carolina, the Clean Smokestacks Act, that this act called for the reduction in pollutants from coal-fired power plants nearly 3 decades ago, that has had a significant impact on air quality and health, and we'll hear more about that tomorrow. But this afternoon, we're going to ask Bill to introduce our keynote speaker. Bill?
Thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to introduce Elizabeth Biser. She's just completed a very successful 3.5-year run as Secretary of the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. I use the verb run intentionally because that's how her staff described her pace as Secretary. One of the crucial issues that Elizabeth and the department dealt with and led on during her watch was PFAS. So we're lucky to have her here today to talk about that. She's also just completed a very successful term as president of ECOS, the Environmental Council of the States. That's an organization of all the environmental secretaries and commissioners from the 50 states. PFAS also a big issue with ECOS, and we may hear about that. Elizabeth recently decided that the time was right to return to the private sector and resume her consulting business, Biser Strategies, where she'll put to work her wealth of national and state policy experience. So it's hard to believe, right, that I've known and worked with Elizabeth for almost 20 years now. Just out of college, she applied to be the legislative liaison to the North Carolina Department of Environment and Natural Resources when I was the secretary there. This legislative job she applied for was a big job, lots at stake. My staff had recommended a number of really qualified other people, older, much more experienced. But there was something special about Elizabeth and about her combination of what I'd call gumption, people skills, and fearlessness. So we hired Elizabeth. She did a great job as our legislative liaison, and she's done us proud as secretary. So again, it's a pleasure and an honor to introduce Elizabeth Biser, or as I like to call her, Madam Secretary.
Well, thank you, Bill, and good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be introduced by Bill Ross. Seeing the wonderful things that he did as secretary when I worked for him in his administration was one of the things that put me on the path to wanting to do the same thing. One of the many things that Bill excels at is harnessing the power of partnerships. And I think that's a great theme for what we're talking about today, because PFAS is a huge issue. And it is going to take the power of partnership for us to be able to move forward, where we're working together, asking hard questions, and charting a path forward together. So today we've heard a lot about what's being done currently to address PFAS, looking at its impact on human health, on communities. And the issue is so big. I often describe PFAS as a glitter bomb, right? If you think about it, it goes off, it goes everywhere. It's hard to clean up. For anybody who has kids and has dealt with glitter, you know what I'm talking about. So today I want to talk about a little bit about where we've been. We talked some already about that today, and then what the path ahead looks like. North Carolina, as you know, became a national leader on PFAS by necessity. We didn't set out and choose to be a leader. We had to be a leader because of the Chemours facility. It started back in 2017 when Gen X was discovered in the Cape Fear River, and DEQ took decisive action under then Secretary Michael Regan with a consent order. And that consent order required Chemours to take a number of actions. It required them to stop the discharge of wastewater into the Cape Fear River. It required a barrier wall with an extraction well system behind it, which we permitted in the past couple of years. That's going to remove 99.998% of the PFAS that's currently in that very saturated groundwater. It required testing of private wells. You heard Emily reference almost 10,000 homes have qualified for filtration, both in the upper and lower Cape Fear regions under that consent order. That means that the levels had to be high enough, 10 parts per trillion for Gen X, or a combination of either 10 or up to 70 parts per trillion total. So, there also was required to put a thermal oxidizer on to address air emissions, and another a limit on how many pounds of PFAS they could release each year. All that being said, we know that PFAS is bigger than one company or one chemical. Chemours gave us early practice, but we know that we needed to do a lot more than just look at what we've done in that one facility. So a few years ago, DEQ came out with an action strategy for PFAS. I'll characterize it as three main categories: research, regulate, or remediate. We had to research to understand what's out there, which compounds are we finding most commonly in North Carolina's environment, how do we have the correct toxicological information to be able to move forward with standards, which is important for the regulation. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. And then remediate. We already have a lot of PFAS that's already in our environment, and we have to take care of what's already out there. So now I want to take a few minutes talking about groundwater surface water standards. We know that EPA came out with drinking water standards, which is a wonderful thing. We have been testing hundreds of systems throughout the state in preparation for that federal drinking water standard to come into effect. You asked about elementary schools earlier. We've been testing not only the public water systems that are run by counties and municipal governments, but we're also looking at the smaller water systems. So we actually found a situation in Asheboro where there was an elementary school that had the highest levels of PFAS that we found in any testing of the public water systems in the state. We worked very quickly with that school system to get filtration in place before school started. That doesn't address what happened for the years before we knew what happened, but we are making sure that we're getting out there, and especially for sensitive populations, prioritizing those. But let's come back to standards. So we know that PFAS doesn't magically appear in drinking water. It gets in there from into surface water and groundwater, both through discharges and also through air emissions. But we're going to focus on water to start with. Absent groundwater and surface water standards, ratepayers will bear the entire cost of compliance for the federal drinking water standards. I want you to think about that. It's not the polluters, it's residents. Anybody who's a ratepayer. That's why I will say I've been a very outspoken advocate for groundwater and surface water standards, as has the department. As you may know, the EMC has been stalling on taking action on those standards. How many of you think that having standards in place is a good thing, making sure we're protecting the source water of what's going into our drinking water? So how many of you would think that that's an important thing to do? Okay, should be everybody in this room. How many of you, I'm going to ask my DEQ colleagues to not raise their hands for this because they are definitely at these meetings. How many of you have attended an EMC meeting? Okay, so not a lot. You don't count either. Dr. Lowerly is on the EMC. That number, I want to see all of you who just raised your hands and said that you think that surface water and groundwater standards are important. I want to see all of you getting more active at the EMC. The EMC needs to hear from you. You need to weigh in when we have, weigh in normally, weigh in when there's comment periods, looking at our scientific colleagues, academic colleagues in the room, making sure that any kind of evidence that you have, you can bring forward and submit as part of those public comment periods. But also it's important just to make your voice heard. It's important to actually show up at the committee meeting, at the full EMC meeting. I know it's a lot of time out of your schedule. I know you all are very busy, but these things make a difference. They have to know that you're paying attention and that you understand what they're doing, and that they're not just continuing to push off any action on these standards in the dark. They need to understand that you all know what's happening, and you value seeing progress on surface and groundwater standards. This is important for a number of reasons. One of the commissioners recently said that, or they're starting to question whether or not PFAS is actually in food. We know that 86% of the water being used in agricultural operations is coming from surface water. So it stands to reason that you would want to look at what is going into your surface waters, what kind of discharges are being put into there from industry before, if you're going to be watering your crops with it or watering your livestock with it. That's how we've seen in other states there be issues with the food supply chain. We know that there's a lot of body of evidence to show that there's a direct correlation here. Also with biosolids, there's so many examples we could use right now, but you think about, the PFAS accumulating into biosolids that then are land applied onto fields. That's not only affecting crops, it could also affect groundwater contamination. So I just would ask you all to make sure that your voice is heard. These decisions need to be made based on science and data and not based on politics. I do want to take a moment to recognize the DEQ team. If you're a member of DEQ, can you stand up or raise your hand? These folks have worked tirelessly over the years to really push this issue forward, to make sure that groundwater standards and surface water standards and other permitting, we're having to do a lot of detective work to see where these discharges are coming from, where the air emissions are coming from. And they are so talented and so dedicated, and they are learning more every day. So we are definitely better off for their service. So where do we go from here? Besides needing the surface and groundwater standards, I want to address 3 different areas. We need to have a bigger focus on the life cycle of PFAS. We really need to move our focus next towards air, and we need to enhance our state and federal collaboration. So to talk about the life cycle in PFAS, I think about Cat in the Hat. That book where you're moving the pink blob from the rug to the wall to the shower, and he just is moving it around. That's all we're doing with PFAS unless we take the steps to capture and destroy it. We're just smearing it around, and we're moving it around the country in some cases. So one example of this is to think about what the secondary and tertiary impacts of the drinking water standard are. Don't get me wrong, drinking water standard is a wonderful, wonderful thing. But we have to think about what's happening to that material. So we are installing a lot of granular activated carbon and reverse osmosis systems throughout the country, not to mention in our state. And so with the granular activated carbon, the way that gets cleaned, if you will, is it gets sent up to a facility where it's thermally treated. Well, we've got to pay attention to air emissions. We know from experience in North Carolina that air emissions are a significant factor in the spread of PFAS. And so if we're not paying attention to what's happening with these facilities, because it has to be very, very hot in order to actually break the bonds of the PFAS, then we could just be creating sites, for example, in the Northeast that have high levels of Gen X. We may just be taking our pollution and putting it somewhere else. That's a huge problem. I also think we're going to see more facilities like that popping up throughout the country, perhaps even in our state, because the demand is going to be there to be able to refresh, need to refresh carbon. You also have to think about reverse osmosis systems. They're creating a concentrated residual product that can't just go back into the water. It has to be treated, captured and destroyed. So we need to make sure that as we're putting these systems into place, we're thinking about what happens next. And we have to be asking those questions of going down that pathway. We know that PFAS gets into the water cycle, right? If we think about, I think this is like 3rd grade science, right? We need to go back there and think about how it moves throughout the atmosphere and through our surface and groundwater. And we have to make sure that we are taking those steps and looking far enough down the road that we're not creating additional problems. We also need to have greater technological advancements for destruction and disposal. EPA recently came out with destruction and disposal guidance. We, along with New Mexico, submitted comments back to EPA that it really is largely insufficient at this moment. And this is because they're talking about thermal destruction, which again, I've already mentioned what the problems with that can be, deep well injection, or landfilling. We also have a lot of experience with the negative impacts of that. You have PFAS and leachate, and a lot of times it's going to wastewater treatment plants, where it then is making it back into surface waters and biosolids. So I want to go back to this air issue for a moment. We have to have air regulations for PFAS. We know that PFAS transports through wet and dry deposition, predominantly wet, in other words, rain. I'm really grateful for the work of scientists like Dr. Ralph Mead, who I know you'll be hearing from later. I know a lot of what I have learned has been from him, along with our great team. But we know that air transport is the top source of contamination around the Chemours facility itself. We know that we're currently at 27 miles out from the facility where that air transport has taken place in qualified homes for filtration. So think about that for a minute. That air, just the emissions from the plant, from the air, has gone out 27 miles. So if we don't address that, we're not getting the whole picture. For those reasons, we need EPA to take action on the hazardous air pollutant petition that North Carolina, New Mexico, and New Jersey joined together and petitioned about a month and a half ago to regulate 4 PFAS compounds: PFOA, PFOS, Gen X, and PFNA. While we know that there are many, many other compounds out there that need to be addressed, we already have an extensive body of research on those 4, and EPA has everything that they need to take action. And so we would encourage them to move forward to make sure that we can manage that source of PFAS. And lastly, it brings me to needing to make sure that the state and federal partnerships are strong. We need great collaboration. You started off talking about the need for partnership, and this is another area. While as president of ECOS, we began a series of dialogues between states and EPA to talk about the life cycle of PFAS. And it's a good conversation because we have, very different perspectives. EPA is able to sit back and do research. My EPA colleagues in the room are grateful for you, and make sure that we have what we need to take action. But the problem is that with these types of issues, the states have to take action before we have perfect information. And Dr. Larley, I think about something that you said to me once, is that when you're a surgeon, you can't wait for perfect information to operate. You just have to go ahead and save a life. And this is the same type of situation where we have to operate sometimes without all of the facts in front of us, but we have enough facts to take action. And so with PFAS, a lot of the states are already out way far ahead of the federal government because they can be, because they're a lot more nimble and because they have unique experiences. And so I know North Carolina is one of those states, but we've also benefited from the experience in collaborating with other states who also have been out there in certain areas. And so, I think deepening that relationship between EPA and the states so that we're learning from one another is going to be important for us addressing this. And then also with Congress. So I've been very engaged with Senate EPW as they've been having conversations on this. There are some, as always, politics that would have to get resolved, but there is a lot of bipartisan acknowledgement that we do need to take action, that this is a serious issue. With EPW, Senator Capito, her hometown is actually impacted by PFAS. I'll say Senator Tillis has also been a great advocate for this as well. We've got to get bipartisan action, not only for policy support, but also for funding. State assessments need to take place. North Carolina is further ahead than most, but a lot of states just need funding to be able to do testing. Testing is expensive. Doing fish tissue analysis takes a lot of funding. There's so many different areas we could go down that states need to address, and a lot of states don't have the type of funding they need to do it. So we need to make sure that we're supporting our partners, getting Congress to take action, not only to help support our public water systems, who are going to need help with additional funding sources to help meet the new federal drinking water standards, but also help the states identify what the origination of that pollution is and where they can clean it up. We could talk about so many other aspects of PFAS, and I know I'm really looking forward to this afternoon's conversations, and it can get overwhelming and discouraging at times. So I do just want to take one moment here at the end to back up and say, we've done hard things before. You think about acid rain, you think about ozone, you think about some of these big, hairy, sticky environmental situations that felt like we would never get past. PFAS feels like that too sometimes, but we can get past it. I know that we can. We've done it before. We will do it again. I'm confident of that. It may take us some time. It may take a lot of resources. But just like those other issues, if we come together, we've got to look for global solutions, making sure that we're not acting individually, but acting collectively. We can absolutely make a difference on this issue and find the greater good. So thank you all for all the work that you're doing and continue to do to support this important issue. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Madam Secretary. As Bill Ross mentioned, would you mind taking any questions? Would there be any questions from the audience? The question I had, just to start us off, was the comment you made about having your voices be heard, and I do think the opportunity to really weigh in on the Environmental Management Commission and really as a citizen express the interest that your community has in finding appropriate regulatory frameworks for water quality and so forth. And one of the things I learned in serving on that commission was the difference between drinking water, surface water, groundwater. They're regulated by different parts of the federal government and the state government. And there's finger pointing that, well, that's not our job because that's the wrong water to be regulated. And I think your explanation of the drinking water standards are impacted by the groundwater and surface water standards because that's the source of the drinking water. But you have to, again, as a citizen, express that awareness, express the outrage, I would perhaps add, that to sort of cloud the issue in a veil of this is not an appropriate venue to talk about drinking water, which has a direct impact on health, because we're only regulating groundwater, is really sort of a mixed message at best. But I don't know if you want to comment about the interplay of the community in supporting action and avoiding inaction by the EMC.
No, that's a great point, and I think I would call it disingenuous at best how it's sometimes being characterized. Not separating them with false walls, right? We know, I mean, again, we go back to third grade, right? And we go back to the water cycle, and we know that this is all connected. We know that surface water and groundwater connect, right? We know that we get our drinking water from surface and groundwater. Like this is not hard. And so in order to look at what's coming out of your tap, in order to prevent utilities, like I'm looking at Ken Waldrop over here, Ken's cost for operation and maintenance of the granular activated carbon system they've installed is directly tied to what the pollution coming in looks like. So if they've got high levels of PFAS coming into their system, they're going to have to refresh that GAC more frequently because they start having breakthroughs, especially with short chain compounds. And so to the extent we can reduce the amount of contamination that's going into those systems, we can reduce, for those who've already had to put filtration in place because their levels are high enough, certainly reduce their ongoing operation and maintenance. Not to mention it's just better for the environment, for human health, for other folks who are relying on water for fish or for for private drinking water wells. But also it's you look at a town like City of Raleigh. Raleigh has levels that are just under the federal drinking water standard. They can use powder activated carbon to remove those levels now. If those levels go up significantly, they're going to have to install costly new treatment technology along the lines of what CFPUA and Brunswick County have. That's going to cost their residents a lot more as well. And in Brunswick County's rates have gone up 40%. And this is why litigation is pending for those two, but for others, there's some litigation here and there, but residents are going to be on the hook to pay for the vast majority of this. And so that's why it's important that we are not letting those false arguments get in the way of having a conversation about how PFAS is in the water cycle and we have to address it.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I am Brandon Stafford. I've come from 5 years EPA and currently serving as the Environmental Justice Coordinator with the North Carolina Black Alliance. I want to start off by saying thank you for the work you do and have done. I think it's important that stuff like that is acknowledged, so thank you. My question is a little bit in regards to some of how education in regards to PFAS. A lot of times the grassroots, quote unquote, but the people who aren't as involved have a hard time understanding it. How have you seen DEQ, or do you foresee DEQ kind of working to educate and empower some of these communities? I know you have some community advisor board opportunities as well, but outside of maybe webinars and things that are posted online, how has DEQ been intentional about making sure that these communities are advocated for?
Great question, and I'll say so. I'll speak looking back at some of the things we've done, and of course, I know that the next secretary will be continuing this important work. But we'd certainly have held a lot of community meetings in areas that are impacted. One example was as we started doing testing around the Sampson County landfill. We held a community meeting to answer questions and to tell them what we're doing. So we've tried to be very transparent in how we operate. There's also been a number of meetings, especially earlier on during the consent order process with the communities impacted in the upper Cape Fear region to begin with. And then when we expanded that testing for the lower Cape Fear region, had a lot of community meetings. There are good website resources. I know that's not available to everyone. But we are, I will say, the team is very responsive, and we get questions every day from residents and answer those questions. It's also helpful when community groups get engaged, and when we can help the community groups have the information they need and they're able to help educate, that's really powerful too, because the more residents understand about what's happening about PFAS in North Carolina, and I say about North Carolina specifically because we do have a higher burden than many states do, then you're going to see more action, because then as the more, as folks have mentioned, there are elections this year, as more people are understanding what's happening or not happening, and they're able to make sure that they're, the folks who are in charge of making laws for them or making rules for them are hearing from them that this is important. That's going to be really important moving forward.
Madam Secretary, thank you very much for this wonderful broad overview of PFAS in the state of North Carolina. Thank you very much. You briefly alluded to acid rain as a mechanism by which we learned the long-range transport of pollutants. My question to you is there any reason to believe that PFAS, which the problem that just didn't magically appear 2 years ago or 5 years ago, it has existed for quite a long time, that the long-range transport is a lot longer than the 26 miles that you alluded to? Could it be that it is a whole lot more and larger swath of North Carolina has been impacted by PFAS? Thank you.
Thank you. I think that, and I'm going to say that there's the air quality panel this afternoon can probably give a more detailed answer, but Chemours is not the only one that has air emissions of PFAS. And so we have a lot of data around the Chemours facility itself, so we can very definitively sit here and tell you we're at 27 miles and counting. We have not delineated the extent of contamination yet, but we know that there are other air emission sources as well. And given that North Carolina is a heavy industrial state, we fully expect that we're going to find other areas where this has been the case. And that's why we did the action strategy for PFAS, looking statewide at this issue. And we're gathering information from our water quality monitoring network, working in collaboration with universities and the PFAS testing network, and our other partners to see how do we get a complete picture. And then it's a detective exercise, right? So then we have to back into it. But the short answer to your question is yes, we fully expect we're going to see long-range transport, which is why we petitioned EPA to make PFAS a hazardous air pollutant. We need to have a regulatory tool to be able to get at it.
Thank you for your service again, Secretary Biser. Could you speak a little bit to this trend of the chemical industry funding alternative facts or pay-for-play scientists, and how the audience might weigh in on that activity?
That's an excellent question. To get some specifics on that, you can check out a letter I sent to the EMC during my last full week at DEQ, which cites different news sources. Michael Dorson, for example, is a scientist that the North Carolina Chamber has employed, who is an industry scientist for hire. And we've seen this playbook play out right in other areas, not just PFAS. You look at the tobacco industry, for example, where they hire people to say it's fine. And they're making insincere comparisons to contaminants that have no scientific basis to be compared to PFAS with. And so the World Health Organization, as many of you probably know, recently disbanded the committee that was considering their drinking water standard, largely because they had set a drinking water standard of 100 parts per trillion. As we know, EPA is at 4 parts per trillion. And a lot of industry was using that disparity as a reason to try to attack what EPA is doing. Well, come to find out, they disbanded it because of too much influence from industry-funded scientists, including the Guardian article actually name-checked Michael Dorson, the same person that the North Carolina Chamber hired. And so it's really important that we are good consumers of our information, that we're examining where facts are coming from or lack thereof. And that's the other reason why it's really important to have your voices heard at the EMC, because they are certainly hearing from the industry-funded voices.
Thanks so much for being here today. My name is Yancey, and I'm lucky to work with college students who are interested in going into environmental impact careers. So I'd love to hear a little more about your personal story. Many of the students I work with are drawn to nonprofit work or maybe corporate careers. Talk to us a little bit about your interest in public service, what we might, students here might think about in a calling to that career path, what we might take back to students in our lives, and what skills as educators can we begin to impart to our students to be more effective in those roles.
Absolutely, because we certainly need the next generation involved. My story is I was interested, actually acid rain was one of the things that I got very interested in as a child. My dad was in public service as a county manager, and so when I was 18, had the opportunity to intern for State Senator Steve Metcalf during the passage of the Clean Smokestacks Act, which if you're not familiar, I would encourage you to go look it up. Bill Ross was secretary at that point and was a leader in getting that passed. It cleaned up SOx and NOx and mercury emissions from coal-fired power plants in the state and was wildly successful. That actually married my love of environment and government in that summer after my freshman year of college. And so right after school, I interned at the legislature every summer during college in a semester, and I went to work for an environmental nonprofit for a year before going to work for Bill at Diener, and then went to private practice, or went to a law firm called Brooks Pierce, and continued to work on a lot of environmental issues from a private side while I went back to school at night to get my master's of public administration at Carolina. And then had a chance to go build a policy program for a national recycling nonprofit before coming back to a consulting practice that then led to coming back as secretary. It was a roundabout path, but public service is so important, and it's something that drives me. I will tell you that my favorite job I've ever had, was working at Diener until I was able to come back as the DEQ secretary. It's very rewarding to get to work on this, and always happy to talk to any students if you about the importance of going to this role. Thank you.
Thank you.